Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David McMahon. I'm a professor of history here at Kirkwood Community College, and I want to welcome all of you to Kirkwood Community College. You're very welcome, particularly on this bright sunny day here in Iowa. This is not the best weather. We're glad to have a live audience. This is also being live streamed and being recorded so that we can get the most people to hear this as possible. But thank you very much for coming out to hear a story of survival and resilience, and those are stories that we need now more than ever. This occasion we'll have a talk by our speaker, of course, and then there will be ample time for questions and answers afterwards. And our speaker very much wants you to ask questions, so be prepared to ask questions. At 79 years old, Erika Schwartz is one of the youngest survivors, and so almost all of her memories are those of her mother, who was the only other survivor from her family. Schwartz's story has elements of miracle, much like those of other survivors, assistance from non-Jewish acquaintances, fortunate timing, sacrifices from family members, even at times divine intervention. But she also has a second survivor story to share. I ask you all now to please silence your phones, of course, in respect for the speaker, and I give it over to our guest, Erika Schwartz.
Am I live? Is it on? Now it is? No? Hello, testing. Okay, we're good. All right, well, first, a little bit of housekeeping. I feel like I have to say this every time. I apologize for the fact that I have to read it. I've been doing this for years, and I've tried a few times to do it without a script, and I can't. I just can't get through it, so I have to read it. The other thing I want to tell you is that in my talk, although I will tell you of the murder of my family, but I go well beyond that. I talk a lot about my life after the Holocaust, well into my adulthood, and you'll even hear about some things that had nothing to do with the Holocaust. You'll wonder why, but I assure you there's a point, and you'll get the point when I get to the end. My story begins in a Nazi ghetto in 1944 Hungary. I was marked for death from the moment of my birth. Today, I'm living the happiest years of my life. The years in between are filled with miracles, people of incredible courage, and a life-changing decision. My name is Erika Schwartz, but I was born Erika Hornstein on April 23, 1944, in Nyiregyhaza, Hungary, just 2 weeks before all of the women and children in my family were transported to Auschwitz to be murdered. That defines me as a Holocaust survivor, and it's the world I inhabited at the beginning of my life. The other world was as the child of a survivor. My memories are my mother's memories. I was only a year old when the war ended. Okay, this is the same thing that happened this morning. The clicker is not working. Is there somebody here who can help me? Sorry, slight pause, talk amongst yourselves. This is the exact same thing that happened this morning. It's weird. It's never happened before anywhere, but twice here.
It worked this morning, I saw it. Why are you doing what the world?
Do you want me to use, I can use the computer.
Okay.
Oh, don't show them those yet. Okay. And then it'll be, which one? That one? Okay. I can do that. Okay. Here we go. My father, we're good. My father died in a forced labor camp when I was just 11 months old. I never knew him, but when I was just a few days old, he had held me and kissed me. My great-grandmother, grandmother, aunts, and little cousins had all known me. They had held and loved me for the first week of my life. Then, shortly after my birth, most of them were murdered in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. Those were the events that tied me to the world of being a survivor, and that was how I defined myself for the first 44 years of my life. As the child of a survivor, my life revolved around trying to be the caregiver to a mother who had been totally destroyed by the war. She lost her entire family. As far back as I can remember, I knew that I was expected to fill that void. I could never do enough or be enough for her. So in addition to having no extended family, I grew up with the painful message that I was a failure as my mother's child. That was a tough burden for a little kid who had no one to turn to for a reality check. My mother was born in the town of Nyiregyhaza. Until her mid-teens, she lived in that small town surrounded by grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. The entire family lived together. Her parents were Honey Wertheimer, a homemaker, and David Petrover, a watchmaker. She had two sisters, Margit and Olga. She also had two brothers, Avram and Nyiregyhaza. In 1938, when my mother was just 16 years old, the Hungarian government passed laws restricting Jewish participation in ordinary day-to-day life. Jews were forbidden to participate in most professions. Jewish children weren't allowed to attend public schools. Jews were forced to abandon their homes. My mother's family was forced from their home in Nyiregyhaza and moved to the city of Nyiregyhaza. By the early 1940s, people in the United States were already hearing rumors about the murder of multitudes of Jews in Eastern Europe. My grandfather's sister Rose had immigrated to the United States when she was a teenager, and she began to bombard my grandfather with letters begging him to get the family out of Europe. She had done all the work necessary to get everyone to the United States. His response was no. He believed the family was safe and that the war would be over long before the Nazis turned their attention to Hungary. My parents met in July of 1941, and it was love at first sight. They were married on August 20th, just a few weeks after they met, and just 1 week before my mother's 20th birthday. They settled in Budapest, where my father was manager of a bridal shop. Life changed drastically when Hungary, allied with Nazi Germany, began to round up all the able-bodied Jewish men and imprisoned them in forced labor camps. My father was taken sometime in early 1943. At first, wives were permitted to visit their husbands in the camps, and in the fall of 1943, my mother learned that she was pregnant. She was terrified of being alone, and by then was no longer permitted to visit my father. So she left their Budapest apartment and moved in with her parents in Nyiregyhaza. On March 19, 1944, Nazis occupied the town. By April 17th, during the Passover holiday, they completed the construction of the ghetto. A wall topped with barbed wire encircled the entire Jewish neighborhood. The Jews from all the surrounding towns were herded into the ghetto. On April 24th, the ghetto was sealed and preparations begun to transport everyone to Auschwitz. My grandparents' home was within the boundaries of the ghetto, so all of my mother's female relatives and their children, most of whom lived in small nearby villages, were moved into the house. The men had long ago either been taken into forced labor, like my father was, or had been dragged from their homes, forced to dig their own grave, and shot, as was my grandfather. Now living in the home with my grandmother were my mother's sister Margit and her two little boys, Mickey and Imre, my mother's sister-in-law Clara and her little girl, Gigi, my great-grandmother Dina, and my mother's younger sister, Olga. I was born on April 23rd, just one day before the Nyiregyhaza ghetto was sealed. But my mother and I were no longer there when the transports to Auschwitz began, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. All of the women and children who remained in my grandparents' house were transported by cattle car to Auschwitz. The Jews were loaded shoulder to shoulder into the cattle cars. There was no room to sit. There was no food or water. The trip took days. There were always numerous dead bodies by the time the train arrived. On the day they arrived, my great-grandmother, grandmother, and three little cousins were murdered in the gas chamber. By the end of May, all 17,580 Jews in that ghetto had been transported to Auschwitz. It's been estimated that between 600 and 800 survived the war. When the cattle cars were unloaded at Auschwitz, a life-or-death decision was made immediately by the presiding SS officer. A person's answer to the simple questions, how old, healthy or ill, determined whether you would live or die. The elderly, too young to work or ill, were sent immediately to the gas chamber. If you were clutching a child who was too young to work, you were sent to the gas chamber with the child. No one grabbed a child away from its mother. That would cause panic, and panic was to be avoided at all costs. My mother's older sister Margit and her sister-in-law Clara were the only ones who survived the initial selections. Like many of the young women who weren't clutching children when they reached the front of the selection line, they were chosen for slave labor in the camp. Although the two young women had arrived with their children, some of the Jewish prisoners who were forced to help unload the cattle cars tried to convince all of the young women to hand their children over to the elderly. They tried to save the lives of these young mothers by calmly telling them that it would be better to let the children go with older people. These young women, of course, didn't know that they were sending their children to their immediate death. Margit and Clara handed the three children to my grandmother. I can't imagine what her last moments were like in the gas chamber with her three little grandchildren. Clara, my mother's sister-in-law, was the only one who survived the war. She told my mother how her sister, Margit, died. Margit survived until the very end, working in the kitchens of Auschwitz. On the day of liberation, on the very day that the Allies entered Auschwitz to liberate the prisoners, many of the remaining Nazis were so intent on killing Jews that instead of fleeing from the Allies, they stayed to randomly shoot and kill as many Jews as they could. My Aunt Margit was killed on the day of liberation. 3 people were instrumental to the fact that I'm here. As I mentioned earlier, my father was imprisoned in a forced labor camp. In spite of widespread rumors about the death camps, the men in the labor camps were the few who believed that the rumors were true. Amazingly, most Hungarian Jews could not believe that the rumors were true. It was beyond their comprehension that Jews were being murdered by the hundreds of thousands for no reason other than they were Jewish. My father had also learned the system that the Nazis were using to find the Jews. At that time in Europe, many official documents listed a person's religion: birth certificates, marriage certificates, entries in a census. Most of them listed your religion. So using these documents and the addresses associated with them, the Nazis demanded that all Jews be imprisoned in a ghetto closest to their official address. My mother had been living in Nyiregyhaza, but her official address was still the Budapest apartment in which she and my father had previously lived, and this became the deciding factor that saved our lives. When word reached my father that my mother had given birth and that we were imprisoned in the ghetto, he somehow managed to escape from the labor camp and headed straight to Nyiregyhaza. With him, he had official papers with the address of their Budapest apartment. The Jews in Budapest had not yet been rounded up, and he knew he could buy time if he could get us there. He was right. Almost every Hungarian Jew who survived the war was in Budapest. My father arrived at the ghetto when I was just a few days old. He immediately went to the office of the authorities, which in Hungary was the Arrow Cross, a segment of the Hungarian military that was more than happy to help the Nazis. He presented the papers showing that my mother and I should officially be in Budapest. He was, of course, repeatedly turned down, and he camped outside the headquarters for days. When I was a little over a week old, miraculously, he was granted papers to take us to Budapest, and he wasted no time preparing to get us out of the ghetto. After he received permission to take us to the city, my mother suddenly insisted on staying in the ghetto with her mother. He had told her that after getting us to Budapest, he was going back to the labor camp. He knew that he was being hunted, and he was afraid to be with us in case he was discovered with us. So again, terrified of being alone, my mother refused to leave Nyiregyhaza. My grandmother literally pushed her out the door and locked it behind her. My father took us to Budapest and went back to the labor camp, where he died on March 8, 1945, just 2 months before the Allies liberated the camps. My mother's 19-year-old sister, Olga, somehow slipped out of the ghetto when my father got my mother and me out, and she headed straight to Budapest. When they reached the city, my mother and Olga were able to obtain Christian identity papers. Using these papers, they managed to get an apartment, and for 2 months lived quietly and safely as 2 Christian women with a baby. On July 5th, 1944, Olga left the apartment to get food. Just as she stepped out of the building, a former neighbor recognized her and yelled, "She's a Jew." Nearby Arrow Cross soldiers immediately ran in her direction. She turned and ran back into the building with the soldiers close at her heels. She must have realized that she had very few options or none at all that wouldn't lead the soldiers directly to my mother and me hiding in the apartment. So she made a fateful decision. My teenage aunt raced to the roof of the building and jumped. She died on a Budapest sidewalk on July 5th, 1944, and my mother and I were never discovered. When I was in Budapest with my rabbi several years ago, I learned for the first time that my Aunt Olga was buried in a single grave in the Jewish cemetery just outside of Budapest. I have no idea how that could have happened in the chaos of 1944 Hungary. In 2017, our family had a stone erected on what had been for 73 years her anonymous grave. Also in 2017, when I went back to Budapest to see Olga's grave, I was finally able, after decades of searching, to find the mass grave in which my father is buried. So that's the story of the murder of my mother's entire family. However, that's not the end of my story. Sometime after the war ended, my mother's Aunt Rose discovered that we had survived. We were living in Budapest, and my mother was still clinging to the desperate hope that someone in her family had survived. In the chaos of post-war Europe, no one knew who was dead or alive. No one knew what had happened to any of their loved ones. Aunt Rose began the process of getting us to the United States and urged my mother to leave Hungary as soon as possible. She refused. She was sure that any surviving member of her family would be looking for her in Budapest, so she just couldn't leave. It took her over 2 years to accept the fact that she and I were the only survivors. She finally agreed to immigrate to the United States. But by this time, everything had changed. Hungary was now a communist country, and it was almost impossible to get out. Aunt Rose arranged for a distant cousin who was a United States citizen to fly to Hungary, marry my mother, and take her to the United States. There was just one catch. She couldn't leave with me. She would have to temporarily leave me behind. Aunt Rose assured her that once my mother arrived in the United States, it would be a simple process to get me out of Hungary. Needless to say, it was a difficult decision, but she finally agreed. So she turned me over to trusted friends and headed to New York with her new husband. I remember being carried in her arms to the train station and standing there as the train pulled away with my mother hanging out the window sobbing. But I also remember that I was so busy picking up pebbles from the ground that I didn't wave goodbye, and my mother never let me forget that. She had appointed an old family friend with good connections as my guardian, and that was very fortunate because immediately after she left Hungary, the trusted couple disappeared with me. They wanted to keep me. I have the telegram that my mother received from my guardian advising that the couple had disappeared. He urged her to stay put and promised that he would find me. 6 months later, she received another telegram. I had been found and was on my way to the United States. I remember that trip. Next to the picture of me with my guardian is a picture of the actual manifest from my flight to the United States. The highlighted name is me, Hornstein Erika. I clearly remember stepping off the plane at Newark Airport and seeing my mother hysterically screaming my name from the observation deck. My mother's new marriage was only supposed to facilitate getting us out of Hungary. However, she was alone, afraid, and very beautiful. He wanted to stay married. So she agreed. What a mistake. He turned out to be very violent. I remember coming home from kindergarten one day and finding my mother lying beaten on the living room floor. It took her almost 2 years to finally get the courage to leave, and leave we did, in a hurried, terrified run while he was at work. So that was the beginning of heart-thumping, frightening incidents that would define my life for decades. It was also the beginning of my journey through 9 different elementary schools, and that had a huge impact on my life well into my adulthood. I was always the new kid on the block, and I had a very difficult time making friends. We were constantly on the move. When I was 7, she met the man who would become my stepfather, but even that didn't settle us down. From the time they married until 2 years later, when the first of my 2 brothers was born, we had already moved 3 times. A year later, my second brother was born, and we moved 2 more times before my mother and stepfather finally settled in the one place that I would stay until I got married. High school was the only school I ever went to from start to finish. I had a ton of emotional baggage by the time I got into high school. I had developed the habit of lying to try to make myself stand out quickly in all of my new schools. I had no idea how long I'd be in any one neighborhood long enough to make friends, and I was desperate for friends. Of course, the lies always backfired, but I had not yet learned that lesson. To make matters even worse, the dad that I was so thrilled about when I was 7 turned out to be no dad at all. He never treated me like a daughter, and he and my mother fought all the time. So, I acted out in a way that I later learned was typical for a young girl with no father. I was insanely boy crazy. I had a crush on so many boys that I lost count, and with a mother who wasn't paying attention, my life was miserable. I was still trying to find ways to shortcut the path to popularity. I hated being home. There was constant yelling and hysteria. My mother was always screaming at me or my stepfather. Trust me, there's a point to all this. Then, shortly after my 16th birthday, I suddenly realized that my knight in shining armor had been present in my life all along. I had known Bill since I was 4. He and his family lived in the same Bronx apartment building that my mother and I lived in when we first came to the United States. Our mothers had become best friends, and our families occasionally got together over the years. I was just 10 when I had my first crush on him, but of course he was just one of many crushes. And he was 4 years older, so not interested. But everything changed when I was 16 and our family attended his brother's bar mitzvah. We hadn't seen each other in a few years, and the sparks started to fly immediately. We began dating shortly after that. But I didn't make it easy on him. We dated on and off because I was still having crushes on many boys. When I was 18, something finally clicked. He proposed, I said yes, and we got engaged. A year later, we married and recently celebrated our 60th wedding anniversary, so I think I finally grew up. However, the years of being raised by a very broken mother had a huge effect on my ability to function. Survivors of the Holocaust, those who were old enough to experience the horrors, and who knew and loved the family members who were murdered, were traumatized beyond anything that can be imagined. It's difficult to even talk about the atrocities and inhumanity that they witnessed. They were damaged for life. Some were resilient enough or lucky enough to be able to eventually rise above the trauma and find happiness. Others never recovered. My mother never recovered. She was unable to feel empathy, unable to demonstrate the kind of love that a child needs, and some of us never get. I never heard her say that she was proud of me or that I was a good daughter. I did everything for her until the day she died, but her need was so great that whatever I did was never enough. Not only didn't I have my emotional needs met as a child, I also had no role model to show me what it meant to be a loving wife and mother. It nearly ruined my marriage and had a profound effect on my children. She was also unable to share her children with anyone who wasn't related to her by blood. I often felt that I had to choose between my mother or my husband, or even between my mother and my 2 sons, because both of my sons were adopted and not related to her by blood. And even between my mother and my one and only grandchild. So for many years, I was my mother. I needed all the attention from everyone around me. And if I didn't get it, I would go into a rage. Exactly the same behavior that I had experienced from her. After Bill and I married, she was still demanding my full attention. So we fled to Maryland. But as soon as we bought our first house, she immediately sold her house in New Jersey and moved a couple of blocks from us in Maryland. This pattern would repeat itself until the day she passed. Her last house was right across the street from us. In addition to all the stresses of dealing with my mother, there were many more aspects of my adult life that made me feel as if I was constantly being victimized by fate. And the word victim is an important part of the rest of my story. As I mentioned earlier, our 2 sons were adopted. Shortly after our first baby, David, was placed with us, Bill became very ill. He had Crohn's disease, and it created havoc in our lives for years. For months after Bill became ill, we were terrified that the adoption agency wouldn't let us keep our son. And David, incidentally, was the product of the Summer of Love in San Francisco. Both of his birth parents were heavily into drugs when he was conceived, and he wound up with severe ADHD, a challenge to this day. Our second baby, Jeremy, was Navajo and born in Arizona. We were still living in Maryland at the time, and the bureaucratic red tape took 3 months to navigate before we could bring him home. And for those 3 months, Jeremy was in a foster home where he was neglected. What we didn't know until he became a teenager was that neglect during those first 3 months of life can cause failure to bond syndrome. Our beautiful little boy was never able to fully connect emotionally with us or with pretty much anyone else. We tried everything. When the signs became obvious, we sought help in every direction, and nothing worked. And yet, there was more chaos on the horizon. Trust me, there's a point. After both of my brothers moved to California and got married, I decided that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life living a continent away from them. Bill and I had begun to have a pretty decent and stable life in Maryland. Chaos was on the back burner for the first time in my life. Bill had established a successful landscaping business, and we were relatively happy. And his agreement to walk away from all of that was certainly proof of his love for me. Because in 1979, we moved to California. Of course, my mother moved too, and the chaos that had begun to ease in Maryland exploded in California. The relationships between everyone fell apart. Bill couldn't get a business going and fell into a deep depression for years. My mother was trying to be the center of attention of all 3 of her children, and it pitted us against each other and ultimately resulted in the deterioration of our sibling relationships. Worst of all, both of my sons discovered drugs shortly after we moved to California. The ensuing years were a nightmare. Everything was going wrong. For 44 years, I had seen myself as the victim of circumstances completely beyond my control. Then one day, I heard someone say the most important sentence that I ever heard, and it went like this: "You may not have control over anything that's happening around you, but you have complete control over everything that happens between your 2 ears." And those words sunk in immediately. For the first time in my life, I realized that my happiness or lack of happiness just might be a choice. I could find joy in my day, because there was some, or I could find misery very easily. I could see only the bad, or I could seek what was good. It was a choice. At that moment, I became determined to learn who I really was. I had lived my life exactly as I had been taught to, but it never felt like the real me. How do I find happiness when everything around me is always falling apart? It seemed impossible, but for some miraculous reason, I knew I had to do it. And I found a roadmap. I started writing a gratitude list every day. Before my feet hit the floor, each morning I grabbed pen and pad and wrote a list of everything I could think of for which I was grateful. You've heard the saying, "Smell the roses"? Well, I literally did. I took long walks, deeply inhaled the scents around me, listened to birds, and marveled at the beautiful blue sky. I'm sure I looked pretty goofy to my neighbors at times, but I guess that's what's called meditation, and I could feel the stress melting away. I knew I had to combat the terrible, negative thoughts about the people in my life. I hated everyone. They were constantly in my head. So I worked at finding the good, and that became another daily list. I resented my mother. I would write every good thing she had done the previous day. I was angry at my husband, my kids, my siblings. I wrote lists of everything I loved about them. And slowly, I realized it was working. I had been programmed by nurture to see only what was bad in my life. But to my astonishment, I realized that I did have the ability to see what was good. I just had to learn how to tap into it. It wasn't easy. I had spent 44 years mirroring my mother's perception of life. And it took several years for me to overwrite the program in my head. I clearly remembered the day that I realized I was no longer working it. What I desperately wanted was coming easily and naturally. Today, I cherish all that I have rather than focus on what I don't have. I count my blessings every day. And most importantly, I've learned to let go of people over whom I have no control. Also in 1988, obviously the most important year of my life, my one and only grandchild, Kim, was born. She's Jeremy's daughter, and the odds were slim that she would even be in our lives. He was 17 when she was born and deeply into drugs. Her mother could have easily shut us out of their lives, but she didn't. She encouraged the incredible relationship we have with Kim, and both Kim and her mother are at the top of my gratitude list every day. When Kim married her wonderful husband and they had 3 children, my amazing great-grandsons, my heart burst with joy, and I couldn't imagine ever having a sad day. However, several years ago, they moved from California, where we all lived, to Springfield, Missouri, and it broke my heart. They had been the center of our lives, and when they moved away, my world literally fell apart again. But in 2019, we moved to Springfield, Missouri, because Kim and her husband convinced us that they wanted us to live near them. And so began the best years of my life, but that doesn't mean that everything's been perfect. Our precious son, Jeremy, Kim's father, was a lifelong alcoholic, and last year we lost him to liver failure. What got me through that awful time was simply gazing at my granddaughter, her husband, and their children, and being constantly reminded that my greatest gift came from him, counting my blessings. As I said at the very beginning, I'm living the happiest years of my life. So a final reminder, you may not have control over anything that's happening around you, but you have total control over what happens between your 2 ears. And that's really the end of my story, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. I didn't think I'd have to say this to a group of adults, but it takes one brave person to raise their hand, and I promise you, thank you.
Why did you decide to adopt?
Why did we decide to adopt? I couldn't have children, and I desperately wanted to be a mom.
In the apartment in Budapest, why did the Nazis not come and kind of sweep the building and clear everybody out?
Why didn't they round the Jews up in Budapest? Was that your question? Because most of the Jews that survived in Hungary were in Budapest because the Nazis never got around to being able to gather up and transport all of the Budapest Jews to Auschwitz. They started in the countrysides because it was a lot easier. And all the Jews that lived in the countrysides outside of the big cities were the ones that were murdered. By the time they turned their attention to Budapest, the Allies the war was very, very close to over, so they never had the opportunity. That was the luck of the draw.
How many miles away was your apartment in Budapest from your parents' house, from the house that you lived in with your mom and grandma?
How far away was your house in Budapest from where you were living when they moved you? Your dad came and got you and you moved to Budapest. How long of a journey was that?
I have no idea how long, what any distance was. Sorry.
Did your mother talk often about the pre-Nazi occupation?
My mother was very reluctant to talk about her early life or the war. Everything that I learned from her was the result of questions that I asked her. She was always willing to answer my questions, but she never volunteered any information. I do know a little bit about her life before the war with her family. And of course, after she passed away, I thought of 1,000 questions I wish I had asked her. So she did talk a little bit about it, but she never, one of the questions I was asked this morning was, did your mother ever tell you anything good about her life? And I don't remember her ever telling me anything good. Her stories were always about difficult times, even before the war. So.
My question is, did you ever reach out to God in prayer?
Did I ever reach out to God in prayer?
In prayer.
Sure.
That's
Absolutely.
wonderful, because our God, our Lord and Savior, is merciful, loving, kind. He could lift you up.
Was that another question? Okay.
Why do you think your mom followed you wherever you went?
I was, of her 3 children, first of all, I was her only daughter. And ironically, I was the most important one of her children to her, because I was all she had left from all the losses she suffered in the war. Her entire family, Hungarian, her roots, I was all she had left. So she did follow me everywhere. And I understood that. But of course, the flip side of it, as I said, was that she had this unspoken need for me to fill that hole, that huge hole that had been left by the loss of everyone. And I felt it all my life, all of her life. And that's why there was nothing I could do to fill it. It didn't matter. I tried desperately till the day she died to satisfy the need that she had for how she wanted me to be, and I couldn't do it.
Now, you seem well balanced and a content person, but what are some of the demons that you have fought with all of your life?
What are some of the demons I've had? Wow. It's interesting. Every once in a while I get asked a question, even though I've done this hundreds and hundreds of times. Every once in a while I get asked a question that I've never been asked before, and that's one of them. I think if you would have asked me that question 20 years ago, I would have had a long list, because what I remember about the person I was 20 years ago was someone who was constantly fighting demons in my head, constantly. I could have given you a long list. To be honest, today I can't remember a single one, and that's the blessing of my life today. I wish I had an answer, but then again, I'm glad I don't. I can't remember.
How did your father learn of your birth? Did he get told, or I don't know how that happened.
How did my father learn of my birth? I don't know. That's also a really good question, and one that I wish that I would have asked my mother. I don't know. There are things about that whole part of the story that I never got details filled in, because I've also been asked, how did my father, how was he able to escape from the labor camp? And I have no idea. So I don't know the answer to that.
Have you ever had a chance to visit Auschwitz or any of the camps, and if so, what feelings did that provoke?
Asking if you've ever been back to Auschwitz or Budapest and what feelings that brought forth.
Oh, did I ever go back to Auschwitz or Budapest? I certainly did. I've been to Auschwitz 3 times. The first time was horrendous. It was an emotional nightmare for me, just stepping foot or just walking. I remember the first time I saw the railroad tracks when our bus was getting close and I saw the railroad tracks that led up. I don't think I can even describe what I was feeling because I knew this is where my grandmother and my 3 little cousins had been murdered. I was an emotional wreck, but I do have to, there was one experience at that first trip. Every once in a while I remember to tell it when I'm asked that question. We were on a trip with our rabbi, and there were several people from our congregation on that trip. And I was with a very dear friend. I was with my husband, but a lot of people on that trip were close friends. And I think it was one of my joint replacements. I've had 4. And it was one of my joint replacements, and I was having a hard time walking, and they had even gotten a wheelchair for me in case I needed it. But when we were walking out, I was pushing the wheelchair myself, but I was hunched over, my head was down. I was feeling just incredibly awful. And walking next to me was one of my close friends, and all of a sudden she grabbed my arm just as we were getting to the exit. And I haven't told this story in a long time. It's gonna make me cry. And she stopped me, and she said, "Give me that wheelchair." And I just said, "Why?" And she said, "I'm gonna take that wheelchair, you're gonna stand up straight, and you're gonna walk out of here with your head high." And that was amazing. That was just amazing. The other 2 times I was in Auschwitz was, I was participated in a program called the March of the Living. It's a worldwide program that takes high school seniors and Holocaust survivors to Poland to visit the camps and the mass graves and all that. And, but the other 2 times were easier. And I've been to Hungary a few times. Last time, my husband and I went with the older of my 2 brothers, Mark and his wife, and we were there for an entire week with a tour guide, and by that time I had completed all the research that I had been doing for years, so I had addresses and places that were part of our history, and we visited. We stood in front of the property where the house had stood where my mother was born, and we stood in front of the property where the house stood where I was born. Neither one of the houses was there anymore, but we visited a lot of important places, and I think that gave me closure, that last trip.
Thank you for your presentation. I have 2 questions. What happened to Great Aunt Rose? And how did you obtain all the photographs that you have?
Well, Aunt Rose was a big part of our lives after we came to the United States. She was, she was everywhere in our lives. I remember going to Coney Island with her many times because she loved the ocean. She passed away of breast cancer when she was in her 70s, many, many years ago. The photographs that I have of my mother's family were in an album that my father had given her when they were married, and she had filled with pictures of her family. And during the war, that album and me were the only things she held on to. It was all she had left at the end of the war, was that album and me. And I remember as my brothers and I were growing up, long before the age of technology and scanners, we used to fight about who was going to get that album when Mom was ready to give it up. And fortunately, we didn't have to worry about it because we finally got all the pictures scanned and we all have them now.
Was your husband Bill Jewish when you married him? And did he have any history?
With the Holocaust?
Sure.
No.
Okay.
No, Bill's parents were both born in the United States. His grandparents immigrated, one set of grandparents from Romania, the other one from Russia, but long before the war. So
I know you said at one point in your life you argued a lot, but it seems to me somehow as you worked through this, he was supportive and
He's here now. He's with me every time.
Yeah.
He travels with me. He comes every time I talk, even if it's local and I can drive 1 mile to where I'm going to speak, and he could stay home and do whatever. He says, I'm coming with you.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, my granddaughter wants to come with me because they live right near us, and he gets very, very upset. I want to go too. He's amazing. And I don't like him to sit too close to the front. I always make him sit towards the back because no matter how many times he's heard my story, he cries.
yeah.
So I can't look right at him when I'm talking.
Would you mind sharing why personally for you you feel like it's important to tell your story and share it with others?
I'm sorry, was that a question?
Yeah, why is it important for you to share your story with others?
Why is it important for me to share my story with others? It's important for 2 reasons. One being keeping my family alive, keeping that 6 million is just an unfathomable number. And so many of them remain faceless and unknown. I didn't want that to happen to my family. So when I first started speaking, it was for the purpose of honoring them. But very quickly my story evolved, and I decided to talk about the rest of my life and what finally happened to help me see life differently. And when I started talking about that, particularly in high school, to high school students, I quickly learned how important that was for many of those kids to hear. So that has become a very, very important part of my talk.
So I have 2 questions. The first one is, did your brothers share the same kind of relationship with your mom that you had as far as how she treated them? And then the second question is, where is David now, your other son?
Okay. I'm having trouble hearing a little bit, so that's why I'm getting help.
I don't know how much help I am. The first question was about if your mother has the same relationship with your brothers that she had with you. Is it strained and difficult? And that question was about your other son, David. She's interested in David.
Okay. Did my mother have the same relationship with my brothers that she had with me? I will say yes and no, because she actually had 2 different relationships with my 2 brothers. The one, yes, the older of my 2 brothers, Mark, but not for the same reason. Her divorce from my stepfather was brutal and also violent. Sadly, for my brother Mark, he looks just like his father. And my mother was a very broken woman. She was not rational. And so my poor brother Mark was often yelled at and said, "You're just like your father." And she was pretty much treated him the same as she treated me. My younger brother Michael looks just like one of her brothers. And of course, her dead family are all saints. So Michael was, because she's gone, her golden boy. So he was treated entirely differently and doesn't quite connect with how my brother Mark and I feel about Mom. And as for my son David, who has been severely ADHD from the beginning, he's doing okay, but he treats his condition, his ADHD, with marijuana. So he's a daily pot smoker, which has not been good for him in terms of his maturity level, but it works for him. And he's productive, and I love him dearly. He's a wonderful son. And I'm looking forward to visiting him in California in a couple of weeks.
Yes, ma'am. I remember seeing a documentary about 2 years ago about a growing underground Nazi movement in Germany and Spain, and it was growing very quickly. The question I have for you, ma'am, have you heard of a growing migration from Gentile lands of Jews going back to Israel?
Sorry, what was the question again?
A growing migration of Jews leaving Gentile lands and going back to Israel for security.
He's asking if the Zionist movement to go back to Israel, if that feels like it's strengthening, if it's getting
Oh, okay. So are more people moving to Israel from other countries for security? Yes. Yeah, I think so. I think so. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's a tsunami, but I mean, just yesterday when I spoke at Coe College, a young girl came up to me and told me that when she graduated, she was going to move to Israel because she wanted to raise her children in the Jewish homeland.
I had heard from 3 different sources there was a migration leaving Gentile lands. I just wanted to know what you, saying as being on the inside, have heard. Thank you.
Do you think that your mother's emotional issues came from her trauma in the war?
Do I think that my mother's emotional issues came from her trauma in the war? That is a great question, and I have asked myself that question many times. Sadly, I don't know, because the one thing I never had the opportunity to do was to talk to anyone that knew her as a child, or even very much before the war. All the people that she grew up with were dead. And I often wondered, was she difficult as a child or as a young woman, or was it the war that created what I experienced? I wondered that too, and I don't have the answer to it.
In some of your tours and trips back to Auschwitz and working with other survivors, as you connect with other children of Holocaust survivors, do you see a common thread in their?
Yeah, one thing that I have noticed with all of the Holocaust survivors that I've met is that they tend to fall on 2 opposite ends of the spectrum. There doesn't seem to be an in-between. They either are like my mother was, and I've met many who were bitter to the end, just could not give their children the kind of nurturing that they needed because of the trauma that they suffered. Or the other end of the spectrum, where they came, once the war was over, they became so determined to create a wonderful life out of gratitude for having survived for themselves and their children, that their kids felt like they were living in Disneyland. It was literally 2 ends of the spectrum. So there were common threads, yes. And I did meet many that were like my mother, but I also met others that were the exact opposite.
And the children of those survivors that were like your mother.
Generational trauma.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That you didn't.
Absolutely, especially the ones that were raised by survivors who were left emotionally scarred.
Did that make you feel a little more normal?
No, it didn't, because other people's suffering didn't ease my suffering. So it just, I was so deeply into my own misery that what other people were going through for all those years just didn't affect me. I was very focused on the horror of my life. Thank God those days are over.
It's very commendable that you were able to kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps and reset and commit to that. That is amazing, and I'm so thankful for you that
Thank you.
happened.
I consider it a miracle.
Maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll.
I'm not in a hurry. Okay.
I was going to ask, have you met any survivors that were actually in the camps and their experience that you've been told of, like what they had to do and after everything?
I met many survivors that were in the camps. All the survivors that I traveled with when I went on the March of the Living were all older than me. And so they all had personal memories, personal experiences, and I heard their stories. As a matter of fact, because I'm one of the youngest survivors and have no personal memories for many, many, many years, actually until my husband actually was the one that finally poked me into starting to tell the story, I didn't even think I had a story to tell. It just felt like I was not in the same league as the ones that had suffered and been in the concentration camps. But thankfully, once I started telling the story, I found I did have a story to tell.
I was just wondering, I don't know, you probably don't remember because you were so young when you were in Budapest, but how did your mother survive being so young with an infant as far as food and being able to get an apartment?
She was very reluctant to talk about how she survived in Budapest for those final months of the war. I only managed to get a couple of very short stories from her, things like she used to go out and at night and forage for food because there was no way that she could legally get food. And she would just go through bombed out buildings and any place that she could go where she thought there might be some remnants of food. And one story that she told me, one night she found a little jar of beans, and she wasn't able to breastfeed me. She had no milk. And so she was feeding me whatever she could find, and I was only a few months old. And she said she cooked down those beans, managed to boil them down to mush, and fed them to me. And I screamed from gas pains for hours. And she told me she was terrified that we would be discovered. I remember that story. But I've also, it's another thing that I wish I would have asked her, because she never volunteered to tell me everything that happened or how she survived.
What advice do you have for future generations for standing up against hatred and discrimination?
What advice do I have
For future generations to stand up against hatred.
What advice do I have for future generations to stand up against hatred? Don't hate. Just don't hate. One of the things that astounds me is that we haven't learned from history. I mean, it's still going on. People are, especially right now, people are hating each other for the most ridiculous reasons. You know, politics and just stupid, unimportant things. They're important, but people should be talking about them, not hating each other over them. One of the things I tell students when they ask me, you know, what can we do to prevent things like that from happening? And I tell them to study how the Holocaust started. Because what people need to understand, that what made it so easy for the Nazis to do what they did was by completely desensitizing the attitude of the population towards Jews. The propaganda was over the top. There were posters, and you can find them, you can still see them online, posters depicting Jews as rats. And I tell students to learn that, to learn how it started, because it's something that's still happening today. People are being depicted as being awful simply because they voted for somebody. And that has to stop. We can't be hating each other for every slight difference.
So that's our hour, and if anyone needs to leave, you're welcome to go, but Erika's very nicely agreed to stay for a little while, and she's happy to answer any more questions, or if you'd like to come meet her, just kind of figure it out as we go along at this point.
Just come on up. Come on up.